Throughout history, humanity has never stopped fighting not only to defend its lands but to prove its intelligence, courage, and will to survive. Every battle carries untold stories, bold strategies, fatal mistakes, and moments that change the course of the world. Here on Military Tactics Channel, we revisit those pages of history to understand why sometimes a single decision can create a legend. Let's begin today's story. On the 22nd of June, 1941, under the faint glow of an early summer dawn, the largest land invasion in the history of human warfare was set in motion. This was Operation Barbarossa. More than a mere attack, it was a crusade, the violent culmination of Adolf Hitler's obsession with annihilating what he viewed as his ultimate enemy, the vast, enigmatic Soviet Union. A tidal wave of 88 million Axis soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across a 1,000-mile front. Their mission, dictated by the Führer himself, was breathtaking in its arrogance to conquer a nation stretching across 11 time zones and bring it to its knees in just 5 months. The Red Army was caught in a state of strategic shock. Stalin had ignored repeated warnings from his own intelligence, convinced that Hitler would not dare to strike. The Soviet officer corps, already gutted and terrorized by Stalin's murderous political purges of the late 1930s, was paralyzed by indecision. As a result, the initial German assault was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Luftwaffe obliterated the Soviet Air Force on the ground, and the Panzer divisions, the iron spearheads of the German Blitzkrieg, sliced through the disorganized Soviet defenses with terrifying ease. The German war machine, a three-headed dragon of immense power, drove deep into Soviet territory. In the north, Army Group North, under Field Marshal von Lieb, set its sights on Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the south, Army Group South, commanded by the veteran Field Marshal von Rundstedt, tore through the vast, fertile plains of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Union. And in the center, the most powerful of the three, Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Center, had one singular, overwhelming objective: to capture Moscow, the political, logistical, and spiritual heart of the Soviet state. Within weeks, the German advance was measured not in miles but in entire countries. On July 17th, after weeks of brutal fighting, von Bock's forces captured Smolensk, a historic city known as the Key to Moscow. The last major obstacle on the road to the capital was gone. Across the world, military analysts and politicians alike held their breath. From London to Washington, the consensus was grim: the Soviet Union was finished. Stalin, finally shaken from his state of denial, faced an almost hopeless situation. On paper, he had nearly 1 million men to defend the capital, but the reality was catastrophic. Of his 83 available divisions, only 25 were combat effective. The rest were shattered remnants, demoralized, and desperately short of equipment. It was against this army of ghosts that the Germans prepared to launch their final assault. On the 30th of September, 1941, Operation Typhoon was initiated. It was a name that promised a storm, and a storm is what it delivered. The German plan was a masterpiece of encirclement, designed to trap and annihilate the remaining Soviet forces before they could retreat to the capital's defenses. At Bryansk, 2 entire Soviet armies were caught in a pincer. To the north, at Vyazma, the jaws of the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies snapped shut in a colossal maneuver, trapping another 4 armies. The first line of Moscow's defense hadn't merely been breached, it had ceased to exist. In these pockets alone, more than 660,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, bringing the total number of prisoners taken since June to a staggering, almost incomprehensible 3 million men. The road to Moscow now lay wide open. Stalin was left with a skeleton force of perhaps 90,000 exhausted men and fewer than 150 tanks to defend a city of millions. By October 13th, the lead elements of the German panzer groups were a mere 87 miles from the Kremlin spires. Panic swept through the city as a cold, suffocating fog descended. The Soviet government began a frantic evacuation of key industries and officials. Martial law was declared. The city was being transformed into a fortress, but it was a fortress without an army. But just as German victory seemed inevitable, the Russian landscape itself rose in defiance. An ancient and undefeated general took command, General Mudd. The autumn rains, the dreaded Rasputitsa, had begun. The unpaved roads of the Soviet Union, never built for heavy mechanized traffic, dissolved into a vast, churning sea of impassable mud. German tanks, with their famously narrow tracks designed for the firm roads of Western Europe, sank up to their turrets. Supply trucks, the lifeblood of the offensive, became hopelessly mired, sometimes advancing only a few miles a day. The blitzkrieg, a strategy utterly dependent on speed, was now literally stuck in the mud. Reluctantly, on the 31st of October, the German High Command called a temporary halt to the offensive. This desperate pause, granted by the heavens, was the miracle the Soviets needed. Stalin, displaying the ruthless energy that defined his rule, used this time to summon his nation's hidden reserves. From the farthest reaches of Siberia in the Far East, divisions of hardened, winter-acclimated troops began a 1,000-mile journey westward. These were men who saw snow not as an obstacle, but as their natural element. At the same time, from evacuated factories now safely beyond the Ural Mountains, a steady stream of new 34 tanks, arguably the best tanks of the war, began arriving at the front. As the temperature plummeted, the mud froze into iron-hard, rutted ground. The German offensive could now resume. On November 15th, the panzers lurched forward once more. The plan was to encircle Moscow, squeezing it into submission. The 3rd and 4th Panzer armies would strike from the north, while the 2nd Panzer Group would attack from the south, trapping the capital in a final, decisive pincer. But now the Germans faced their second great enemy, General Winter. The temperatures plunged to levels their meteorologists had deemed impossible for November: 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below zero. For the German soldiers, still dressed in their light summer uniforms, it was a vision of hell. Frostbite became as great a threat as enemy bullets. Weapons seized up, the metal so cold it tore the skin from a soldier's hands. Tank engines refused to start unless constantly warmed by open fires. The Soviets, clad in their warm white winter coats and felt boots, were in their element. They met the freezing, exhausted Germans with ferocious resistance. For 2 agonizing weeks, the German armies clawed their way forward, fighting for every village, every frozen river, every patch of forest. In the south, the 2nd Panzer Group was bled white and stopped cold before the city of Tula. In the north, the 4th Panzer Group, in one last superhuman effort, managed to push across the frozen Moscow-Volga Canal. Small units of the 7th Panzer Division were now just 22 miles from Red Square, but they were spent, a shadow of the force that had begun the invasion. They could go no farther. Near the small factory town of Klin, just 18 miles from the Kremlin, the German offensive reached its absolute limit. A persistent legend arose that a small German patrol glimpsed the golden spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. It's a powerful myth, but almost certainly untrue. The camouflaged city would have been invisible. What those freezing soldiers likely saw was a cruel mirage. The low winter sun glinted off the frosted rooftops. This was the high watermark of the Third Reich. The small, isolated group of German troops in Klin waited for reinforcements that would never come. On December 3rd, they were unceremoniously driven out by a hastily assembled force of local militia and a handful of tanks. Today, the spot is marked by a simple, stark memorial, a line of giant anti-tank obstacles. On December 5th, 1941, the German offensive against Moscow officially stalled and died. The storm of Operation Typhoon had blown itself out. Then, across the entire front, the Red Army, which the world had written off as dead, unleashed a massive, unexpected counteroffensive. 100 new divisions, including the elite Siberian ski troops, slammed into the freezing, exhausted German lines. For the German soldiers, it was a nightmare. The hunters had become the hunted. By the time the Soviet offensive halted in January of 1942, the Germans had been hurled back, in some places, more than 150 miles from the gates of Moscow. The threat to the capital was over. The battle had cost both sides a combined total of more than 2 million casualties, a staggering toll of human suffering. The myth of German invincibility lay shattered, frozen in the endless Russian snow. The epic struggle for the soul of the Soviet Union was far from over, but its turning point had been reached. The long, bloody road to Berlin had begun. The Battle of Moscow was more than a single engagement. It was an epic turning point, forged in mud, snow, and unimaginable sacrifice. It stands as a testament to the brutal realities of the Eastern Front, a hidden chapter of history, too often overshadowed by other events of the war. Every story in history teaches us valuable lessons about strategy, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Thanks for exploring today's story with us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to discover more fascinating historical stories with us. See you in the next episode, where strategy and intelligence continue to shape history.